The crystalline towers of Nexus Prime stretched toward the violet, sky-like fingers reaching for the stars that surrounded them in all directions, and from every window of every tower, the representatives of 847 species could look out and see the most perfect achievement of galactic civilization, peace that had lasted for 15,000 years without a single war or conflict, or even a minor skirmish between worlds in the grand chamber where the Council of Harmonious Voices met every planetary cycle. The air shimmered with translation fields that converted every language and every thought pattern into something all could understand, and today, like most days, the council discussed trade routes and cultural exchanges and the thousand small details of keeping nearly 1,000 different species living together in harmony. Humanity had joined this great experiment 3,000 years ago, and they had been model citizens from the very start. But everyone knew the stories about what humans had been before they joined, and the older species remembered when Earth's delegation first arrived, with heads bowed and weapons surrendered, in a solemn promise that they would never again let their violent nature control them. The humans had been warriors once, and they had nearly destroyed themselves in conflicts so terrible that even the ancient species shuddered when they read the histories, but that was long ago, and the humans who lived now were gardeners and artists and philosophers who wrote poetry about the stars and built hospitals on worlds that needed them. The colony world of Viridiance 7, where 300,000 humans had made their home among purple forests and silver rivers. Governor Chen stood in her office and looked at the delegation that had just arrived from orbit, and she felt something cold move through her chest, even though she could not say why. The Zelvari were an old race, much older than humanity, and they were tall and thin, like trees made of silver metal, and their faces had no expressions that humans could read, but they were known throughout the Concordat as collectors and preservers of endangered species. We have come with a matter of great importance. The lead Zelvari said, and his voice came through the translator as smooth as oil on water. Our genetic scanners have detected troubling patterns in your colony's population, and we believe you face a significant bottleneck in your gene pool within the next 5 generations. Governor Chen felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face neutral as she had been trained. I was not aware of any such issue, and our own medical teams have reported no concerns. Your medical teams are competent, but they lack our 40 years of experience in preserving species. The Zelvari responded, and he gestured with one long metallic hand. We have seen this pattern before in 17 other species, and in each case intervention was necessary to prevent long-term genetic collapse. The second Zelvari stepped forward and projected a hologram that showed complex genetic models and probability charts that Chen could barely understand. We request permission to take 200 of your youth into our preservation program, where they will be cared for, and their genetic material will be used to ensure the long-term survival of your colony. Chen's hands gripped the edge of her desk. You want to take our children? We want to save your species, the first Zelvari corrected. This is standard procedure under Concordat Law, Article 7. 445, Section 12, and as members in good standing, you are required to cooperate with preservation efforts. Chen called her legal advisors and her medical team, and they spent 6 hours reviewing the Zelvari's data and the relevant laws, and everyone agreed that the genetic models showed real concerns, even if they seemed to have appeared suddenly, and the law was clear about cooperation with preservation efforts. How long would they be gone? Chen asked, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. Communication will be maintained throughout the process, the Zelvari assured her, and they will be returned when the genetic stabilization is complete, which typically requires 15 to 20 years. 20 years felt like a lifetime, but Chen thought about the future of the colony and about her responsibility to the 300 people who depended on her decisions, and she thought about the Concordat laws that humanity had sworn to uphold when they joined this great peaceful civilization. She gave her permission. The selection was done by lottery, to be fair, and 200 children between the ages of 4 and 12 were chosen from families across the colony, and Chen attended every single goodbye at the spaceport and watched parents hold their children and promise that they would talk every day through the communication. channels, and that 20 years would pass quickly. Little Maria Santos was 6 years old, and she hugged her mother and asked if she would get to see the stars up close, and her mother said yes, and tried to smile even though tears ran down her face. Young Chen Wei was the governor's own nephew, and he was 10, and he shook his aunt's hand like a grown man and told her he would make the family proud, and she had to turn away, so he would not see her cry. The Zelvari Ark ship was beautiful in the way that ancient things are beautiful, and it rose from Viridian 7's surface with 200 human children aboard and disappeared into faster than light. Traveled toward what the Zelvari called their preservation facilities. For the first 2 weeks, the parents received daily messages, and the children seemed happy and excited, and they talked about the amazing things they were seeing and learning. Then the messages became less frequent, and the responses to questions became more vague and generic. After 6 weeks, all communications stopped completely. Governor Chen contacted the Zelvari embassy at Nexus Prime, but her messages went unanswered, and when she finally reached a Zelvari official, she was told that the Ark ship had entered the Obsidian Reaches for the preservation work, and that communication was difficult in that region, but that all the children were fine. The Obsidian Reaches were a region of space beyond Concordat jurisdiction, where old powers and ancient races maintained their own territories and laws, and where the Concordat's authority meant nothing. Chen demanded that the Council of Harmonious Voices take action, but the council moved slowly, as it always did, and committees were formed, and investigations were opened, and diplomatic channels were explored. Months passed, and then a year, and the parents of Viridian 7 gathered in larger and larger groups, demanding answers and demanding action and demanding that someone bring their children home. The council sent formal requests to the Zelvar leadership and received formal responses that everything was proceeding according to plan, and that the children were safe and healthy, and that preservation work could not be rushed, but there were no videos and no voice messages and no proof that any of it was true on Earth in the capital city of New Geneva. The human representatives to the Concordat met in emergency session, and they reviewed everything they knew and everything they suspected, and the truth became clear. The Zelvari had taken the children and disappeared, and the Concordat was going to do nothing about it. Tambasarda Kahali stood before the assembly, and his voice was steady, but his hands shook. The Zelvari have diplomatic immunity, and they operate under preservation protocols that give them broad authority in the council. Will not act against them without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. They took our children. Someone shouted from the assembly floor, "They took our children." Under legal authority, Kahali responded, and his face showed the pain of saying those words. And unless we can prove they violated the preservation protocols, we have no legal recourse. In the back of the assembly chamber, Admiral Sarah Okonkwo sat in her military uniform and listened to the debate and thought about her niece, Maria, who had been on that Ark ship, and she thought about the 199 other children who had trusted the adults to keep them safe. She thought about the promises humanity had made 30 years ago when they joined the Concordat, and she thought about the weapons and the ships and the capabilities that humanity had sworn never to use again. She thought about what promises really meant when children were involved that night. She returned to her office in the Earth Defense Coordination Center, and she opened files that had not been accessed in 30 years, and she began making calls to people who commanded ships and stations that officially did not exist. Humanity had promised to be peaceful, and they had kept that promise for 3,000 years, but no one had ever asked what would happen if someone mistook peaceful for helpless. Admiral Okonkwo began to prepare the answer to that question. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood in the observation deck of the Earth Defense Coordination Center and watched the holographic display show the Concordat Council's latest response to humanity's demands, and the message was exactly what she had expected. More committees and more investigations and more patient requests for humanity to trust the process. 18 months had passed since the children disappeared, and every single day felt like a knife turning in her chest because her niece Maria was out there somewhere and no one seemed to care enough to actually do anything about it. The human government debated and argued. Some said they should wait for the Concordat to act, and others said they should accept that the children were gone and work within the system to prevent it from happening again and through it all. Okonkwo watched and listened and realized that no help was coming. She made her decision on a Tuesday morning at 0600 hours when she accessed the classified defense network and entered a code that had not been used in 3,000 years: protocol reversion. The code went out through channels that official records claimed no longer existed and reached commanders of installations that official documents said had been dismantled, and within 6 hours, Okonkwo began receiving responses from places that were supposed to be empty station. Thermopylae confirmed active status from its position hidden inside the asteroid field beyond Mars, and its commander reported that all systems were operational and crew was ready. The Agincourt battle group confirmed active status from its camouflaged position inside Jubro's red spot and reported that their weapons systems had been maintained and upgraded according to the secret protocols. The Stalingrad defensive network confirmed active status from its positions scattered throughout the Kuiper belt and reported that their ships were fueled and their crews were prepared. One by one, the responses came in, and Okonkwo realized that humanity had never really disarmed and had never really abandoned its capacity for war, and instead, they had simply hidden it and waited and hoped they would never need it. Again, within 72 hours, the entirety of Earth's true military capability began to move into position, and ships emerged from hiding places in gas giants and dark matter clouds and behind carefully positioned debris fields. Concordat observers watched in growing shock as humanity revealed what it had kept secret for 3 millennia, and the ships that appeared were not the small defense cutters that humanity claimed to operate, and instead they were warships built with technology that made Concordat vessels look like children's toys. Ambassador Tlora of the Regelian Collective arrived at Earth within a day, and her insectoid form practically vibrated with rage as she appeared on the communication screen in Okonkwo's office. "You have violated every treaty you signed, and you have broken faith with the Concordat, and you have revealed yourselves to be exactly what we feared." Okonkwo looked at the ambassador without expression. "We have violated no treaties because our treaties required us to be peaceful, and we have been peaceful. For 3,000 years, you maintained weapons in secret, and you developed military technology in violation of we maintained the capability to defend ourselves." Okonkwo interrupted. "There is a difference between capability and intent and ... We have shown nothing but peaceful intent for 3,000 years, and now." Tlora Santeni curved forward, and what Okonkwo had learned was a sign of accusation. "Now you reveal your true nature." "Now someone took our children," Okonkwo said, and her voice dropped to something cold and hard, "and your Concordat has done nothing to get them back, and so we will get them back ourselves." Tlora's form shifted in what might have been fear or anger. "You cannot simply take military action against a Concordat member species and expect the Zelvari are not in Concordat space." Okonkwo noted, "They are in the Obsidian reaches where your laws do not apply and where you have no authority and where apparently anyone can do anything without consequence. That region is beyond our jurisdiction, but that does not give you the right to." Okonkwo leaned forward and her hands were flat on the desk. "You have 30 days to retrieve our children through your diplomatic channels and through your legal processes and through whatever mechanisms you claim. Make the Concordat superior to the violent chaos that came before it. And if we cannot, then we will retrieve them ourselves," Okonkwo said. By any means necessary. The transmission ended, and Tlora's image disappeared, and Okonkwo sat back in her chair and allowed herself one moment to shake because she had just threatened 847 species and committed humanity to a path that might end with their expulsion from the only galactic community they had ever known. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Maria's face and heard her laugh and remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle when she was 4 years old, and the shaking stopped. The countdown began, and Earth's military mobilized fully, and every human world received the same message: prepare for what comes next. The Concordat tried negotiation with the Zelvari, but received only silence, and they tried sending envoys to the Obsidian reaches, but the envoys returned without answers, and they tried economic pressure and diplomatic isolation, but the Zelvari simply ignored it. Elan Day 29, the Concordat Council sent a final message to Earth. pleading for patience and promising that progress was being made and asking humanity to remember their commitment to peace. On day 30, Admiral Okonkwo sent a single response. We remember everything we committed to, and we remember that some things matter more than politics. On day 31, the first reconnaissance fleet under the command of Captain Marcus Webb crossed into the Obsidian Reaches, and humanity went to war for the first time in 3 years. Webb was a third-generation officer whose grandmother had commanded one of the last warships before humanity joined the and he had grown up on stories of what humanity had been and what they had promised never to be again. But he also had a daughter back on Earth who was the same age as the missing children, and when he looked at his crew, he saw the same determination in every face. The Obsidian Reaches were protected by automated defense networks built by civilizations so old their names were forgotten, and these defenses had destroyed every ship that tried to enter without authorization for the last 100,000 years. Webb's fleet approached the first defense perimeter and stopped, and for 6 hours they did nothing but scan and analyze and study the patterns. Then Lieutenant Morrison at the tactical station looked up with a strange smile. Captain, these defenses were built by someone who thought like we used to think, explained Webb. Ordered they are designed to respond to aggression with overwhelming force, but they analyze threat assessment the way predators do. And they look for attack patterns and hostile intent. Morrison pulled up a tactical display, but we have something they have never encountered. What's that? 3,000 years of pretending not to be predators, Morrison said. We know how to hide what we are, and we know how to approach without triggering territorial responses because we have been doing it for 3 millennia. Webb understood immediately and ordered the fleet to reconfigure, and instead of approaching in military formation, they scattered and drifted and moved with the randomness of debris. The ancient defenses scanned them and analyzed them, and found no pattern of attack and no signs of hostile intent, and let them pass within 8 hours. Webb's fleet was inside the Obsidian Reaches where no Concordat ship had gone in recorded history, and they began hunting for the Zelvarith he found. A Zelvari merchant vessel 3 days later, and Webb ordered it seized, and his boarding teams were efficient and professional. And within an hour they had the crew confined and the ship's systems locked down. Lieutenant Chen was the intelligence officer, and he was Governor Chen's younger brother, and he had volunteered for this mission the moment he heard about it, and now he stood in the merchant ship's interrogation room facing the Zelvari captain. I will tell you nothing, the Zelvari captain said through the translator. You have no authority here, and you have no legal standing, and you are violating. I am not interested in legal standing, Chen said quietly. I am interested in finding the children you people took the preservation. The program is conducted according to... Chen pulled up a holographic display and began showing historical footage from Earth, and the Zelvari captain watched images of human warfare from across the centuries and saw weapons and tactics and brutality that the peaceful Concordat had never witnessed. This is what we were, Chen said. This is what we promised never to be again, and we have kept that promise for 3,000 years. He leaned closer to the Zelvari captain. But you took our children, and if you do not tell me where they are, then I will become what my ancestors were. I will show you every single thing humans are capable of when someone threatens what we love. The Zelvari captain's metallic face could not show expression, but his body language showed something that the translator identified as fear. They are on Zelvari Prime, he said. In the central preserve where we keep our most valuable specimens. Chen felt something dark and cold move through him at the word. Specimens, how many are still alive, he asked. Zelvari captain hesitated. How many? Chen repeated. They do not have exact numbers, but some of the younger ones did not adapt well to the environmental conditions, and the dietary requirements were difficult too. Zelvar Prime hung in space like a silver jewel, and it was surrounded by 3 rings of defensive satellites and 2 orbital weapons platforms, and a fleet of 300 warships that had never seen actual combat because nothing had ever been foolish enough to attack it. Captain Webb stood on the bridge of the Earth warship, Revenge, and studied the tactical displays and knew that a direct assault would be suicide. Because even with humanity's hidden technology, they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Status report, he ordered. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from her station. We have confirmed that the central preserve is located on the northern continent, and the structure is heavily shielded, but our scans. With human children? How many? Webb asked, though he was afraid of the answer. We are reading 183 human life signs, Morrison said, quietly too. 100 children had been taken, and now only 183 remained, and Webb forced himself not to think about the 17 who were gone, because if he started thinking about them, he would lose the cold focus he needed for what came next. Lieutenant Chen approached the command chair. Sir, I've been analyzing the Zelvar defensive patterns, and I believe they are designed to counter conventional attack strategies. And we are anything but conventional, Webb? Finish the thought exactly. Chen pulled up a tactical overlay. Their defenses are concentrated around the orbital approaches and the main landing zones, and they have overlapping fields of fire. That would destroy any fleet that tried to fight through, so we don't fight through, Webb said. We go around. The plan came together over the next 6 hours, and it was insane and brilliant and exactly the kind of thing that only humans would attempt, because it required a level of stealth and patience and precision that the Concordat species had forgotten was possible, while Webb's main fleet positioned itself on an obvious attack vector that would draw the Zelvari's attention: 1,000 small insertion pods, launched from hidden positions throughout the system, and each pod was barely large enough for one person, and they were coated with stealth materials that bent light and scattered sensor beams. The pods drifted on ballistic trajectories that looked like random debris, and they came from 18 different vectors, and they moved slowly enough that the Zelvari defensive systems categorized them as non-threaten. It took 3 days for the pods to reach Zelvari Prime, and by then, Webb's main fleet had begun its approach, and every Zelvari ship and every defensive satellite was tracking the human warships and preparing to destroy them. The pods entered the atmosphere like meteors and scattered across the northern continent and hit the ground in unpopulated areas and forests and mountain ranges, and from each pod emerged a human, special operations soldier carrying weapons and equipment that had been designed for exactly this kind of mission. Sergeant Anna Volkov crawled out of her pod in a purple forest 10 kilometers from the central preserve and checked her equipment and confirmed that her team had landed safely, and then she began moving toward the target. She had a daughter named Sophie, who was 8 years old, and Sophie had been taken from Viridian 7 18 months ago, and Volkov had been preparing for this moment every single day since the special operations teams converged on the central preserve from all directions, and they moved through the Zelvari security perimeter like ghosts, because they had trained for decades in techniques that the peaceful Concordat had never needed to develop. The preserve was a massive structure built of crystalline materials that glowed with soft light, and inside were hundreds of enclosures that held specimens from across the galaxy, and the human children were being kept in a section labeled Endangered Primitive Mammals. Volkov reached the outer wall and placed a device that created a small hole in the crystal structure without triggering alarms, and she slipped inside and moved through corridors that were empty because all the Zelvari guards were focused on the fleet approaching from orbit. She found the human enclosures in a large chamber, and what she saw made her stop breathing for a moment. Children were in transparent cages that were decorated to look like human environments, but everything was slightly wrong, and the furniture was too large, and the colors were too bright, and the whole thing looked like what aliens thought human homes should look like. The children were wearing uniforms that had numbers on them, and they were being observed by Zelvari researchers who made notes on tablets and discussed the specimens like they were interesting animals. Volkov forced herself to move past the rage and focus on the mission, and she signaled her team, and they began the extraction. The children saw the humans in military gear, and at first some of them were scared, but then they realized what was happening, and hope spread across their faces. "We are taking you home," Volkov said quietly, as she opened the first cage. "Stay quiet and do exactly what we tell you." She found Sophie in the third cage, and her daughter looked thinner, and her eyes looked older, but when she saw her mother, she started crying silently, and Volkov picked her up and held her for exactly 3 seconds before putting her down and checking her for injuries. "I knew you would come," Sophie whispered. "Always," Volkov said, and then moved to the next cage. The teams worked quickly, and within 15 minutes, they had all 183 children out of the cages and ready to move, but then the alarm started. Because a Zelvari researcher had noticed what was happening, the facility went into lockdown, and security doors began closing, and Zelvari guards started converging on their position. Plan B, Volkov ordered into her communication device. Plan B was not extraction to the surface where they would be hunted and killed, but extraction into the facility's infrastructure where they could use the Zelvari's own systems against them. The teams moved deeper into the preserve, taking the children with them, and they reached the central control nexus, and Lieutenant Chen, who had infiltrated separately, was already there working on the computer systems. I am in their network, Chen reported, and I have access to planetary defense systems. Can you get us out? Volkov asked. I can do better than that, Chen said, and his fingers moved across the holographic controls. I can give us leverage in orbit. Captain Webb watched as every Zelvari defensive satellite suddenly stopped responding to commands, and every weapons platform went offline, and every ship's targeting system began showing error messages. Then his communication screen activated and showed Lieutenant Chen's face with 183 children visible behind him. Sir, the package is secured, Chen reported, and we control Zelvari Prime's defensive grid. Webb allowed himself a small smile. Well done, Lieutenant. Admiral Okonkwo's face appeared on another screen from Earth. Captain, what is your status? We have the children, and we have control of the planet's defenses, Webb reported, requesting orders. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment, and then she made a decision that would change everything. Broadcast on all Zelvari frequencies, she ordered, I want every Zelvari in the system to hear. The message went out across every communication channel and reached every ship and every home and every receiver on Zelvari Prime. This is Admiral Sarah Okonkwo of Earth Defense Command. Her voice was calm and cold. Your leadership took our evolved children and treated them as animals in a zoo, and 17 of them died in your care. We have taken control of your world not to destroy it, and not to conquer it, but to teach you something that the Concordat has forgotten. Some things are sacred, and some lines cannot be crossed. You will immediately release every specimen from every species that you are holding in your preserves, and you will provide us with the locations of every facility where you are keeping children from other worlds. You have 24 hours to comply, and if you do not, then we will demonstrate what humanity excels at, and I promise you, it is not peace. The transmission ended, and Webb watched the tactical displays show Zelvari ships holding position, uncertain what to do, because their command structure was in chaos and their defenses were compromised. Sergeant Volkov sat with Sophie and the other children in the control nexus, and she finally allowed herself to feel the relief and the rage and the grief for the 17 who had not survived. One of the children, a little boy named Marcus, asked, Are we really going home? Volkov looked at all of them and saw the hope and the fear and the trauma in their eyes, and she made a promise. Yes, she said, we are going home, and no one will ever take you again above Zelvari Prime. The human fleet waited, and throughout the Concordat, species watched and wondered what would happen next, because humanity had just done something that had not been done in 15 years. They had reminded the galaxy what war looked like, but more importantly, they had reminded the galaxy what love looked like when it was pushed beyond its limits. Zelvari had 24 hours to respond, and every second that passed felt like an eternity, because everyone knew that what happened next would reshape everything in the control nexus. Lieutenant Chen continued working on the Zelvari systems and discovered files that showed the truth of the preservation program. Thousands of children from dozens of species taken over thousands of years and kept in facilities across Zelvar space, and studied and catalogued and displayed. Some had been returned after years of captivity, but others had died or been lost or simply disappeared. And the Zelvari had never faced consequences because they operated under the protection of Concordat. Lochin sent the files to Admiral Okonkwo and to the Concordat Council. The Zelvari High Council met in emergency session in their crystalline tower at the heart of their capital city, and the chamber was filled with representatives who had not experienced fear in thousands of years, but who were experiencing it now. We must respond with force, one council member argued. We cannot allow this violation of our sovereignty to stand. Our forces are locked out of their own systems. Another responded, and the humans control our planetary defenses, and they have shown a capability for war that we did not know existed. The head of the council, whose name translated roughly as Silver Path Through Stars, looked at the tactical displays showing human ships in orbit and human soldiers in their most sacred facilities. We need to understand what we are facing, and the humans are not following any warfare doctrine we have on record, because they wrote the warfare doctrines, military advisor said quietly, before the Concordat formed and before most species had left their homeworlds. Humans had already fought and won wars on a scale we cannot comprehend. Silverpath pulled up the historical files that Lieutenant Chen had transmitted to the galaxy and watched footage of human conflicts from across the centuries and saw weapons that killed millions and strategies that sacrificed thousands to save millions more, and a capacity for organized violence that was terrifying in its efficiency. They gave this up to join the Concordat. Silverpath said, "Why would they return to it now we took their children?" The advisor said. Simply on Earth, the Concordat Council transmitted an emergency message to Admiral Okonkwo, and Ambassador Tlora appeared on screen with her antennae curved in what Okonkwo had learned to recognize as distress. "You have created a crisis that threatens the entire foundation of our civilization," Tlora said. The Concordat was built on the principle that force is never the solution. The Concordat was built on the principle that everyone follows the rules. Okonkwo corrected. But the Zelvari have been breaking the rules for thousands of years, and you did nothing. We have processes for addressing violations. Your processes take centuries, Okonkwo said. And children do not have centuries, and the 17 who died did not have time for your committees and your investigations. Flora was silent for a moment. What do you want? I want every child that the Zelvari have taken from every world returned to their families, Okonkwo said. And I want the Concordat to acknowledge that its laws failed to protect the innocent. That would require a complete restructuring of our legal framework. Then restructure it, Okonkwo said, or humanity will leave the Concordat and enforce our own justice. The transmission ended, and Tlora turned to the other Concordat representatives and saw faces that showed confusion and concern across a dozen different species. The humans are threatening to tear apart everything we have built, one representative said. No, Tlora said slowly. The humans are forcing us to examine whether what we built was actually protecting anyone, or just maintaining comfortable illusions. She pulled up the files that Chen had transmitted and began reading through thousands of years of Zelvari preservation records, and what she found made her understand why humanity had gone to war. Children from the Vrel species taken 8,000 years ago, and never returned. Youth from the Karathi civilization kept in facilities for generations. Specimens from 60 different species held in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to cruel. Ow! Did we not know about this, one representative asked. We knew, Tlora said quietly. Just called it preservation and told ourselves it was for the greater good, and we trusted that the Zelvari had noble intentions. On Zelvari Prime, the 24-hour deadline was approaching, and Silverpath knew that they had to make a decision. If we comply, we admit wrongdoing and open ourselves to demands from every species in the Concordat. One council member argued, our entire society is built on the preservation work. If we do not comply, the humans will do something that makes compliance look appealing, Silverpath said. I've studied their history, and when they commit to a course of action, they follow through regardless of cost. They are bluffing. Another council member insisted they would not actually destroy a Concordat world. Silverpath thought about the footage he had seen of human warfare and about the cold precision in Admiral Okonkwo's voice, and about the fact that humans had hidden a military capability for 3,000 years, just in case they ever needed it. They are not bluffing, he said, and we need to understand what we are really facing here. He ordered a communication channel opened to the human forces in the control nexus, and Lieutenant Chen's face appeared on the screen. I wish to speak with whoever is in command, Silverpath said. I am in command of this facility. Chen responded, What do you want? I want to understand what you intend to do if we do not comply. Chen was quiet for a moment, and then he began pulling up files on the Zelvari systems and showing Silverpath exactly what humans had been doing for the past 18 hours. They not just taken control of the defensive grid, but had infiltrated every system on the planet. And they had access to life support and power generation, and communication networks and water treatment facilities. "We do not intend to kill your people," Chen said, "but we can make every aspect of your civilization stop functioning until you give us what we want that would affect millions of innocent Zelvari civilians." "You took 200 innocent human children," Chen said, "and you took thousands more from other species, and some of them died in your care, and you called it preservation." Silverpath felt something he had not felt in his long life, which was shame. "If we release the children, what guarantee do we have that you will not destroy us anyway?" "You have my word," Chen said, "and you have Admiral Okonkwo's word, and you have humanity's word that if you release everyone you are holding, and if you cooperate fully, then we will leave your world intact. The word of a species that threatened us with war. The word of a species that kept its promise to be peaceful for 3,000 years even when it was hard," Chen corrected. "We keep our promises, and we are promising you that if you do the right thing now, we will show mercy." Silverpath made his decision. The transmission went out across all Zelvari facilities, and the orders were clear. Release every specimen immediately and provide full documentation of every individual taken over the last 10 years. Within hours, the preserves began opening, and children started emerging from facilities across Zelvari space, and the scale of what had been happening became clear. There were Karathi teenagers who had been born in captivity and had never seen their home world. There were Viral children who had been taken so long ago that their language had evolved on their home planet and they could barely communicate with their own species. There were specimens from species that had gone extinct, and whose children were the last of their kind, and there were bodies because not everyone had survived the preservation process. The Concordat observers who arrived to document the releases found conditions that ranged from comfortable captivity to outright abuse, and they found evidence that the Zelvari had been conducting experiments and genetic studies that violated every ethical guideline. The Concordat had established Admiral Okonkwo, watched the reports come in from Earth, and felt the weight of what humanity had unleashed. "We just destabilized 15 years of peace," her aide said quietly. "No," Okonkwo corrected. "We exposed 15,000 years of comfortable lies, and now we have to decide what comes next." On Viridian's, Avon Governor Chen waited at the spaceport with thousands of other families, and when the transport ship landed and the children began walking down the ramp, she saw faces she recognized, and faces that looked older and more tired than children should look. Her nephew Chen Wei walked down the ramp holding the hand of a younger child, and when he saw his aunt, he smiled, but it was not the smile of the 10-year-old boy who had left, but the smile of someone who had seen too much behind them. Came 182 other children, because one more had died during the captivity, and the families rushed forward to embrace sons and daughters who they had feared were lost forever. Sergeant Volkov held Sophie and let her daughter cry and promise things that she hoped she could keep about safety and security and never being taken again. But there were 17 families who stood at the spaceport and waited for children who would never come home, and their grief was a weight that settled over the entire colony. The Concordat Council convened an emergency session, and for the first time in 15 years they discussed fundamental changes to their laws, because humanity had proven that the old ways had failed. Ambassador Plora stood before the assembly. "The humans have shown us that peace without justice is not really peace at all, and that laws without enforcement are just suggestions." "What are you proposing?" one representative asked. "I am proposing that we learn from what happened," Plora said, "and that we acknowledge that humanity did not break the peace, but revealed that the peace was already broken." The debate lasted for days, but eventually the council agreed to form a new framework and new protections and new enforcement mechanisms, and they offered humanity a seat on the council with special authority over the protection of young and vulnerable members of all species. Okonkwo considered the offer carefully because it meant humanity would be responsible for enforcing the very rules they had just broken. But when she thought about Maria and Sophie and Chen Wei and all The memorial service on Viridian 7 was held on a hillside overlooking the purple forests. Where the colony had been built, and 18 trees were planted in a circle. Because 17 children had died in Zelvari captivity, and one more had died. During the extraction, Admiral Okonkwo stood with the families and watched as each tree was dedicated to a child who would never grow up and never see Earth's sky again and never know the life they should have had. Maria Santos, who had been 6 years old when she was taken and who had died from an allergic reaction to the food the Zelvari had provided because they had not bothered to check human dietary requirements. David Kim, who had been 12 and who had tried to protect the younger children, and who had been punished by isolation until his spirit broke 17 names and 17 trees, and Okonkwo spoke each name aloud, because remembering was important and forgetting would dishonor what they had sacrificed. "We failed you," she said. "Quietly, we trusted a system that did not protect you, and we believed in laws that did not save you, and we were not fast enough or strong enough to bring you home." Governor Chen stood beside her nephew, who was alive but changed, and she placed her hand on his shoulder. "But we will make sure no one forgets what happened here, and we will make sure it never happens again." The families placed flowers at the base of each tree, and some cried, and some stood in silence, and all of them carried a weight that would never fully lift. But they also carried hope, because their children had been returned, and because humanity had proven that some things were worth fighting. For across the galaxy, similar memorial services were being held on dozens of worlds as species reclaimed their children from Zelvari facilities and confronted the reality of what had been done in the name of preservation. The Korathi held a ceremony for the generation that had been born in captivity, and they welcomed them home, even though these children spoke a language that was thousands of years out of date and understood a culture that no longer existed. The Vrel mourned the ones who had been lost and celebrated the ones who had survived, and they debated what to do with the knowledge that their children had been taken for genetic experiment species after species confronted the truth that the Concordat's perfect peace had been built on the suffering of their most vulnerable members. The Concordat Council met continuously for 6 months to draft new laws and new protections and new enforcement mechanisms. The Covenant of Protected Innocence was the result, and it established that any harm to children of any species would trigger immediate collective response from all Concordat member species were allowed to maintain defensive military capabilities as long as they were transparent about their existence and their purpose. A new enforcement branch was created with authority to investigate claims of abuse or exploitation without waiting for diplomatic processes. Humanity was given a permanent seat on the Council of Harmonious Voices with specific responsibility for ensuring the protection of the young across all member species. Ambassador Flora presented the new covenant to the Assembly. "We have learned that peace is not the absence of conflict but the presence of justice, and that protecting the innocent requires not just laws but the will to enforce them." The covenant was ratified by 844 species, and 3 abstained, including the Zelvari, who were still dealing with the aftermath of their exposure. Though Zelvari faced trials for the leaders who had authorized the preservation programs and faced reparations to the species who had been harmed and faced a complete restructuring of their Silver path-through stars, stood before the Concordat Tribunal and accepted responsibility for what his species had done. "We believed we were saving others, but we were only serving ourselves, and we called it noble when it was simply convenient." He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life working to reunite families that had been separated by Zelvari actions, and he accepted the sentence without protest. The preserves were converted into actual support facilities for refugees and endangered populations, but now they operated under strict oversight and with full consent from the individuals being helped. Children who had been held in captivity received counseling and medical care and support to return to their home worlds or to build new lives if they could not return on Earth. Admiral Okonkwo was offered promotions and awards and recognition for what she had accomplished, but she declined them all. "I was just a parent trying to get children home, and anyone would have done the same." But everyone knew that was not true, because the Concordat had existed for 15 0 years, and no one had done what humanity did. She retired from military service and returned to Viridian 7, where she bought a small house near the Memorial Grove and spent her days helping the returned children adjust to life after captivity. Maria Santos's parents visited her often, and they would sit together and talk about their niece and about the hole she had left and about how to carry grief without being consumed by it. "Do you think it was worth it?" Maria's mother asked one day. "All the conflict and the threats and the breaking of treaties?" Okonkwo looked at the trees growing strong in the purple soil. 18 children died, and 182 came home, and thousands more from other species were freed, and the entire galaxy changed its laws to protect the innocent. "So yes," Maria's mother said. "So yes," Okonkwo agreed. "Though I wish we had acted sooner, and I wish we had not needed to threaten war to make people do the right thing." They sat in silence for a while, and then Maria's mother asked, "Do you think humanity will stay peaceful now?" "I think humanity understands better than anyone that peace is a choice," Okonkwo said, "and that choosing peace when you are capable of war is very different from being peaceful because you have no other option." Lieutenant Chen returned to intelligence work, but now he served in the new Concordat Enforcement Branch, and he used his skills to investigate other cases of exploitation and abuse that had been hidden under layers of bureaucracy and diplomatic immunity. He found patterns of labor exploitation and cultural erasure and economic manipulation that had been happening for millennia because no one with power had cared enough to look. Each case he uncovered led to reforms and protections, and slowly the Concordat began to transform from an organization that maintained comfortable stability into one that actually protected its members. Sergeant Volkov stayed in the military but transferred to training, where she taught new soldiers about the importance of their oath to protect the innocent and about the responsibility that came with capabilities. Sophie grew up knowing that her mother had crossed the galaxy to save her, and she chose to enter diplomatic service because she believed that understanding between species was how you prevented conflicts before they required military solutions. The children who had been taken became a generation that bridged the gap between humanity's violent past and its peaceful present, because they understood both the cost of conflict and the necessity of standing up for what was right. 10 years after the crisis, Captain Webb commanded the Concordat's new rapid response fleet that was designed to intervene in situations where innocents were threatened. He never had to fire his weapons in anger, because the mere existence of the fleet and the knowledge that the Concordat would actually respond to threats was enough to prevent most abuses. The galaxy learned that sometimes the best way to maintain peace was to be visibly capable of ending it. 20 years after the crisis, the first generation of children born under the new covenant reached adulthood, and they grew up in a civilization that actually protected them. Instead of just claiming to the Memorial Grove on Viridian 7, had grown into a forest, and people came from across human space to walk among the trees and remember what had been lost and what had been saved on the anniversary of the children's return. Okonkwo stood in the grove and watched the sun set through the purple leaves, and she thought about Maria, who would have been 26 now if she had lived. "We kept our promise," she said to the tree that bore Maria's name. "We made sure you were not forgotten, and we made sure it would not happen again." The wind moved through the leaves, and Okonkwo chose to believe it was an answer. Ambassador Flora visited Earth that year to mark 2 decades of the new covenant, and she met with Okonkwo. "In the Memorial Grove, my species thought humanity would destroy the Concordat. Flora said, we thought you would bring back the chaos and violence that existed before the peace. And instead," Okonkwo prompted, "and instead you reminded us what the peace was supposed to be." For Flora said, "Not to avoid conflict at all costs, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves." They walked together through the trees, and Flora asked the question she had been carrying for 20 years. "How did you know that threatening war was the right choice?" "I did not know," Okonkwo admitted. "I only knew that doing nothing was the wrong choice, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is convince yourself that you are powerless, when you are not. And if the Zelvari had not surrendered, then we would have done what we promised," Okonkwo said simply. "Because empty threats are worse than no threats at all." Flora understood that this was what made human it.